I never planned on taking a job like that, but when your bank account is sitting at double digits and your landlord has already knocked twice in the same week, you stop thinking about what you want and start thinking about what you can survive. So when I saw the listing for an overnight security position at a distribution warehouse just outside of Columbus, I applied without even reading it. 2 days later, I was sitting across from a guy who barely looked up from his clipboard while he explained that the job was simple. No experience needed, no partner, just me from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 5 nights a week. And when I asked what exactly I'd be watching over, he just said, nothing worth stealing. At the time, it sounded reassuring, but looking back, it should have been the first thing that felt off. Places that have nothing worth stealing don't usually need someone sitting inside them all night, alone, listening to every sound the building makes. But I didn't question it. I took the job, and by Monday, I was sitting in a small glass security booth at the front, surrounded by rows of metal shelving that disappeared into darkness the moment the overhead lights stopped reaching them. For the first few nights, it really was as simple as they said. I'd do my rounds every hour, check the doors, log the timestamps, drink coffee, scroll through my phone, and wait for sunrise. The kind of job where nothing happens, and that's exactly how you want it. Because nothing happening means nothing is wrong, and nothing being wrong means you get paid for just being there. But around my 8th night, something shifted. Not in a way I could explain at the time, not something I could point to. It was more like a feeling that settled in slowly, like the building wasn't as empty as it was supposed to be. Like there was a presence to it that hadn't been there before. I remember the exact moment I first noticed it. I was halfway through my second round, walking along the east wall where the lighting was weaker, when I had this sudden urge to stop. Not because I heard anything, not because I saw anything, just because something felt wrong. Like the feeling you get when you realize someone's been watching you longer than you've been aware of them. I turned my flashlight toward the end of the aisle, expecting to see nothing, expecting to laugh it off. But the beam just hit empty space, rows of shelves, everything exactly where it should be. And still, I didn't move because the feeling didn't go away, it just sat there, heavy in my chest. I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself I was tired, that my brain was filling in gaps that weren't there. When my shift ended, I went home and slept, but the next night it came back, stronger this time, more specific. It started with something small that shouldn't have mattered. The side door on the east wall, the one I checked every round, was slightly unlatched when I pushed on it. Not open, just loose enough that it moved when it shouldn't have. I remember standing there staring at it, trying to figure out how that could happen without the alarm going off. The system logged every entry, every exit, and I hadn't heard anything. Back in the booth, there was no record of it opening. I radioed it in, told my supervisor, and he gave me the same answer. Old building, faulty hardware. I did as he said, but that explanation didn't sit right. I had gotten used to how this place worked, how it felt. That door had never been loose before. Not once. I closed it, made sure the latch clicked, and continued my rounds. After that, I started paying closer attention to everything, the corners, the shadows, the spaces where the light didn't reach. For a few nights, everything stayed quiet. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it until the night I found the food. I was walking through the far west section, a part of the warehouse that didn't get much use, where 2 lights had been out for weeks. My flashlight caught something on the ground that didn't belong there. A plastic bag, half tucked behind a pallet. When I stepped closer, I saw an open pack of crackers, a can of beans with a spoon still in it, and 2 empty water bottles. The first thing I noticed was that it was fresh. No dust, no signs it had been sitting there for days, which meant someone had been there recently. My hands started shaking before I even realized it. There was no reason for anyone to be in that section. No employees, no deliveries, nothing that would explain it. I backed away slowly, my flashlight sweeping the area, checking every corner, every gap between crates. But I didn't find anyone, and that made it worse because it meant whoever had been there wasn't anymore. At least not where I could see them. I radioed it in again, my voice tighter this time. They said they'd send someone out to check, but that wouldn't be for another hour, so I was still alone. Staring at the monitors, knowing that somewhere in that building, someone had been eating, waiting, existing in a space that was supposed to be empty. The longer I sat there, the more I realized something that made the fear settle deeper, heavier, harder to ignore. I hadn't found signs of someone breaking in. I had found signs of someone staying. I didn't leave the booth for almost 20 minutes after I found the food. And that wasn't like me, because up until that point I had forced myself to stick to the routine no matter how uneasy I felt. But something about that small pile of wrappers and half-eaten food changed the way I saw the entire building. Because it wasn't just evidence of someone passing through. It was proof that someone had been comfortable enough to sit down, eat, and take their time, and that meant they didn't feel rushed. They didn't feel like they were about to get caught, which meant they either knew the building better than I did or they knew my routine. And that thought stayed with me as I sat there staring at the camera feeds. Even though I already knew half of them didn't cover the darker sections, and when I finally stood up, it wasn't because I felt ready. It was because I realized sitting still wasn't going to make me any safer. So I grabbed my flashlight, checked the knife I'd started keeping in my pocket after the door incident, and stepped back out onto the floor. But this time, everything felt different. Not physically, not in a way I could point to, but in the way silence works when you're alone, because before the quiet had felt empty, now it felt occupied. Like the absence of sound wasn't natural anymore, like something was holding it in place, and I moved slower than I had before, more deliberate, listening to every small noise my own movement made, the soft crunch of debris under my shoes, the faint hum of the overhead lights. Even my breathing sounded louder than it should have. And as I walked back toward the west section where I'd found the food, I noticed something I hadn't picked up on earlier. Something subtle but important. The two overhead lights that were supposed to be out weren't actually burned out. I could see the faint reflection on the glass. The bulbs were intact. They just weren't screwed in all the way, just loose enough to cut the connection, and that realization made my chest tighten, because lights don't unscrew themselves. Not halfway, not like that. That takes intent. That takes someone physically reaching up and turning them just enough to create darkness without making it obvious. And I stood there for a second, staring up at them, before slowly turning my flashlight back down toward the floor, scanning the area again. And that's when I noticed the footprints, not clear enough to make out details, but enough to see disturbance in the dust, patterns that didn't match the straight lines of forklift tracks or the usual scuffs from workers during the day shift. These were irregular, shifting directions, stopping and starting in ways that suggested someone moving carefully, not just walking through. And they didn't lead toward any door, they didn't lead toward any obvious exit. They just faded, like whoever made them had stepped into a space where the dust wasn't settled enough to hold the shape, or like they had stopped somewhere I couldn't see. And I felt that same heavy awareness settle in again. The sense that I wasn't just retracing someone's path. I was standing in a place where they had spent time, maybe not long ago, maybe not as long as I wanted to believe. And I forced myself to keep moving because standing still felt worse, like it gave whatever might be watching me more time to decide something. And as I made my way back toward the main aisle, I started thinking about my routine, really thinking about it for the first time. How predictable it was, how every hour I followed the same path, checked the same doors in the same order, paused in the same spots to log timestamps, and the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a pattern that could be learned. Something someone could observe and memorize, and that thought stuck with me for the rest of the shift because it meant if someone had been inside this building for days or longer, they wouldn't just know I was there, they'd know where I was when I was and how long I stayed in each place. And by the time my shift ended that morning, I had already decided I wasn't going to follow the same routine again. Not exactly. Because if someone was watching me, the last thing I wanted was to make it easy for them. So the next night, I changed everything. I started my rounds at different times, walked different paths, doubled back without warning, checked the same areas twice in a row and skipped others entirely. Anything to break the pattern, anything to make it harder for someone to predict me. And for a few hours it worked, or at least it felt like it did, because nothing happened. No new signs, no new disturbances, just the same quiet, heavy building. And I almost started to convince myself that whoever had been there was gone, that maybe finding the food had scared them off. Maybe they realized someone was paying attention now and decided to leave. And that thought brought a small amount of relief, just enough for me to let my guard down slightly, just enough to make the next moment hit harder. because I was halfway through a round moving along the north side of the building when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, soft, brief, but unmistakable, the sound of something shifting, not falling, not crashing, just moving slightly, like weight being adjusted on a surface, and I stopped immediately, my body reacting before my brain had time to process it. And I turned off my flashlight without thinking, letting the darkness settle around me as I listened, because in that moment I understood something clearly. If I could hear them, they could hear me, and the building went completely still, no hum, no distant noise, just silence, and I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something else, anything that would tell me where it came from. And for a few seconds there was nothing, and then I heard it again, closer this time. Just a slight scrape, like something brushing against metal, and it came from the aisle directly to my right, and I felt my grip tighten on the knife in my pocket. My heart starting to pound in a way that made it hard to stay steady, but I didn't move, not yet. Because moving meant revealing my position, and for the first time since I started that job, I wasn't just uneasy. I was certain of something. Certain that I wasn't alone in that building. Certain that whatever had been eating in the dark, whatever had been unscrewing lights and moving through those aisles without being seen, was still there, and it knew I had noticed. I stayed completely still after that second sound, not because I had a plan, but because every instinct I had told me that moving too soon would be a mistake. In that moment, the darkness felt different than it ever had before, not empty, not neutral, but occupied, like it was holding something just out of reach. I remember focusing on my breathing, trying to keep it slow, quiet, controlled, because even the smallest sound felt like it would carry too far. As I stood there, I started to notice the way the building sounded when it wasn't just me in it, because there's a difference between silence and stillness. What I was hearing now wasn't silence, it was something holding still, like whatever was in that aisle had stopped moving the moment I did. That realization sent a cold weight through my chest, because it meant this wasn't random. It wasn't just noise, it was reactive, aware. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, carefully, I turned my flashlight back on and angled it toward the floor instead of straight ahead. I let the beam spread out low before I raised it, because the last thing I wanted was to give away exactly where I was looking. When I finally lifted it, directing the light into the aisle to my right, it revealed exactly what I didn't want to see. Nothing. Just rows of metal shelving and stacked crates. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't, because the sound had been real. If there was nothing there now, it meant whatever made it had moved, and the question that followed hit harder than anything else. Moved where? I felt my grip tighten on the knife again as I stepped forward slowly, my eyes scanning every inch of the aisle, every gap between shelves. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I was walking into a space that had just been vacated, like I had missed something by seconds. Halfway down the aisle, I stopped again, because I noticed something new, something small, but impossible to ignore once I saw it. A crate that had been sealed earlier that night was slightly open now, not broken, just shifted, the lid pushed just enough to create a gap. I stared at it, trying to remember exactly how it had looked before, because I knew I had checked this aisle less than an hour ago. Slowly, I stepped closer, raising the flashlight slightly to get a better look inside the gap, and the beam caught something reflective, something metallic. It was a tool, a standard wrench, but it wasn't sitting where it should have been. It was positioned near the edge, like it had been moved. This wasn't just someone hiding. This was someone moving through the building, interacting with things, using the space like it belonged to them. I backed away slowly, because now the idea of turning my back to any part of this place felt like a risk I couldn't ignore. I made a decision. I needed to see if I could catch them on camera, even though I knew the coverage was incomplete. I moved quickly toward the security booth, my ears straining for any sound behind me, any indication that I was being followed. When I reached the booth, I shut the door behind me and locked it, something I had never done before during a shift. I sat down in front of the monitors, pulling up the camera feeds and rewinding the footage from the last 10 minutes. At first, there was nothing, just the same static view of empty aisles and unmoving shelves, everything exactly as it should be. But then I saw it, not clearly, but enough to confirm everything, a shift in the light at the edge of one of the cameras. Something passed through the frame too quickly to make out. Not a clear figure, just a distortion, like something had blocked the light. I paused the footage, replayed it, watched it again, and every time it was the same, that brief interruption. I realized something then that made the situation feel even worse. Whatever was in that building wasn't just aware of me. It had already started adjusting to avoid being seen. I must have replayed that clip at least 20 times, maybe more, because once you see something like that, something that shouldn't be there, you start trying to force meaning out of it, trying to slow it down enough to turn it into something recognizable. But no matter how many times I watched it, it never became clearer. It never turned into a person or a shape I could define. It just stayed what it was, a brief interruption in the light, like something had passed through the frame without wanting to be seen. Eventually I stopped the footage and just sat there, staring at the screen because the realization had already set in. Someone was inside that building with me, and they were careful, deliberate, and patient in a way that made everything feel worse. Because it meant this wasn't random, this wasn't someone panicking. This was someone who understood the space and knew how to move through it. And more importantly, someone who knew I was there. That thought stayed with me as I looked at the clock on the monitor. Realizing I still had almost 3 hours left in my shift, 3 hours in a building that no longer felt like a place I was watching, but a place I was being watched inside of. For the first time, I seriously considered calling it in, telling them I was leaving. But I didn't. I knew what they'd say, that I was overreacting, that I didn't have proof, that it was probably nothing. I didn't want to be the guy who quit over a feeling, even though at that point it wasn't just a feeling anymore. So instead I did something I hadn't done before. I started studying my own movement on the cameras. Not just where I had been, but how I moved, how long I stayed in each place, what patterns I had fallen into. The more I watched, the more obvious it became. I was predictable. There were still habits I couldn't break and routes I defaulted to. If I could see those patterns, then someone else could too, someone who had more time, more patience, and more reason to pay attention. That was when the idea formed. I needed to break the pattern completely. I needed to do something unexpected, something that would force whoever was in that building to react. Up until now, they had been the one controlling the interaction. If I could make a move they didn't anticipate, maybe I could catch them off guard. The fear didn't go away, but it changed. It became sharper, more focused. Now I wasn't just trying to get through the night, I was trying to confirm something. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and instead of heading out through the front, I turned off the lights in the security booth completely. Leaving the monitors as the only source of glow behind me, I waited for my eyes to adjust, for the building to settle again. I stepped out quietly, closing the door without a sound, and instead of my usual route, I moved along the interior wall. Staying in the darker sections, keeping my flashlight off, letting the faint overhead lighting guide me just enough to see where I was going. If someone was watching me, they were used to seeing that beam of light moving through the aisles. They were used to tracking it. By removing that, I was removing the easiest way for them to know where I was. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I started to wonder if this was even going to work, if whoever was in there had already adapted to me. But then, near the area where the mezzanine offices overlooked the floor, I heard something that made me stop instantly. Not a movement this time, not a scrape or a shift, but something softer, more deliberate. A single, quiet footstep coming from above me. The moment I heard it, everything in me went cold. Up until then, I had been thinking in terms of aisles and corners. But that sound changed everything. It meant they weren't just on the floor, they were above me. Slowly, without turning on my flashlight, I tilted my head upward, staring into the darkness of the mezzanine level. Where the old office windows looked out over the warehouse, for a few seconds I didn't see anything, just black shapes. Then, in one of them, just for a split second, I saw movement. Not enough to make out a face, just a shift. Like something stepping back from the glass the moment I looked up. My heart started pounding in a way that made it hard to think. It was confirmation that they had been watching me from above, from a position where they could see everything, my roots and my habits. Everything I thought I was controlling. I realized then that this was a situation I had already been inside of for longer than I understood, and whoever was up there had been studying me the entire time. I didn't move for a few seconds after I saw that shift in the window above me. Not because I was frozen, but because my brain was trying to catch up to something it hadn't considered before. Something that changed everything about the situation, because up until that moment, I had been thinking of whoever was in that building as someone hiding, someone avoiding me, someone trying not to be seen, but the position they had chosen, the mezzanine office overlooking the entire warehouse floor. That wasn't a hiding spot, that was a vantage point. And the more I stood there thinking about it, the clearer it became they hadn't been avoiding me. They had been watching me deliberately, consistently, from a place where they could see every route I took, every pause I made, every habit I didn't realize I had, and that realization didn't just make me uneasy. It made everything feel controlled in a way I hadn't noticed before. Like I hadn't been moving freely through that building. I had been moving inside a pattern someone else already understood, and the worst part wasn't that they knew where I was. It was that they knew where I was going to be, and that thought hit harder than anything else. Because it meant I had been predictable from the start, not just in my routine, but in my reactions, in the way I responded. I felt that shift in my chest again, that heavy awareness that I wasn't catching up to something. I was behind it, and slowly, carefully, I took a step back from the center of the floor, my eyes still fixed on the mezzanine level, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing now, no shadow, no shift, just darkness sitting behind those windows. And that silence made it worse because it felt intentional, like whatever was up there had already stepped away, already adjusted the moment it realized I had noticed, and I knew that standing out in the open like that was a mistake. Because if they could see me clearly from above, then I couldn't see them at all, and that imbalance made everything feel dangerous. So I moved, not quickly, not in a panic, but with purpose, stepping back into the darker section along the wall, putting shelves between me and the open floor, creating distance from that line of sight, and as I did, I started thinking about the offices. I hadn't checked them in detail since I started the job. They were always locked, always empty as far as I knew. But now that I had seen movement up there, that assumption didn't hold anymore, and I realized something else. The key ring for those offices was in the security booth, which meant if one of those doors was open, it hadn't been opened with a key, and that thought stayed with me as I made my way back toward the front of the building, my path slower now, more careful. Because I wasn't just moving through the space anymore, I was moving with the awareness that someone above me might still be watching. And when I reached the booth, I didn't go inside right away. I stopped just outside the door, listening, making sure there was no sound coming from behind me, no movement from the floor, no indication that they had come down. And when I was sure the space around me was still, I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, immediately going for the key ring hanging on the wall. And as I grabbed it, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hesitation, not because I didn't want to check the offices, but because part of me already knew what I was going to find, and that kind of certainty, without proof, without confirmation, was more unsettling than anything I had seen so far. So I took the keys, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped back out onto the floor, heading toward the staircase, and every step I took toward it felt heavier than the last, not physically, but mentally, because I knew that once I went up there, whatever distance existed between me and whoever was inside that building would disappear. And as I started climbing, each step creaking slightly under my weight, the sound carrying farther than I wanted it to, when I reached the top, I stayed just below the level of the floor, angling my flashlight upward first, letting the beam sweep, and what it revealed made my chest tighten instantly, because one of the doors was open, just enough to create a dark gap, and the padlock that should have been securing it was hanging loose, resting against the handle. That wasn't just confirmation that someone had been there. It was confirmation that they were still using that space. Slowly, carefully, I stepped onto the mezzanine level, my eyes locked on that open doorway, the flashlight steady in my hand. A sleeping bag rolled out along the floor, a small lantern placed on the windowsill overlooking the warehouse, all arranged in a way that wasn't rushed, but lived in, organized, like someone had been staying there for more than just a night. My eyes shifted to the window, following the line of sight down to the security booth below, and I saw it clearly then, exactly what they would have seen every night. My chair, my desk, the monitors, thinking I was in control, and that was when the final piece clicked into place, with a slow, heavy certainty whoever had been in that room hadn't just been inside the building, they had been watching me from the very beginning. I didn't step into the room right away, even though every part of me knew I needed to, because standing in that doorway, looking at that setup, the sleeping bag, the backpack, the lantern positioned perfectly on the windowsill, it felt less like I had found something and more like I had walked into a place that already knew I was coming. And that thought settled into my chest in a way that made it hard to breathe evenly, because it meant I wasn't discovering this space. I was arriving at it like I was the last piece of something that had already been arranged. And for a few seconds I just stood there, my flashlight steady on the floor, tracing the edges of the sleeping bag, the outline of the backpack, looking for movement, any sign that someone was still inside, but everything was still, too still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from emptiness, but from something choosing not to move, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant if someone was there, they weren't going to reveal themselves unless they wanted to, and slowly, carefully, I stepped inside, just one step at first, enough to bring more of the room into the light, and the moment I crossed that threshold, the air felt different, not colder exactly, but heavier, like it had been sitting undisturbed for a long time, and I moved the flashlight across the walls, the corners, under the window, checking every space where someone could be hiding, but the room was empty, completely empty, and that should have been a relief, but it wasn't, because the evidence of someone being there was too fresh, too deliberate. The sleeping bag wasn't dusty, the backpack wasn't old. The lantern still had a faint warmth to it when I reached down and touched it, like it had been used recently, maybe within the last hour. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant I hadn't just missed them. I had missed them by minutes, and my chest tightened as I straightened up, my eyes moving back toward the doorway instinctively, because if they weren't here anymore, then they were somewhere else in the building, and the thought that followed that one made everything worse, because I had just come up the only staircase to this level, and I hadn't seen anyone pass me, which meant there was only one other possibility. They were already down there, and for a second, the entire layout of the building shifted in my mind again. Not as a place I was checking, but as a place someone else was moving through, adjusting to my position, staying just out of reach, and I stepped back toward the doorway slowly, my flashlight sweeping the hallway outside before I exited, and when I was sure it was empty, I moved out onto the mezzanine again, heading toward the railing that overlooked the warehouse floor, and I didn't want to look down, not immediately, because part of me already knew what I might see, but I forced myself to, stepping up to the edge, and angling the flashlight downward, letting the beam spread across the aisles below. And at first there was nothing, just the same rows of shelves, the same open spaces, everything exactly as it had been before, and I almost let myself believe that maybe they had left. Maybe they had slipped out somehow while I was focused on the room, but then I saw it, not movement, not a figure, but something worse. The security booth door, the one I had locked before coming up here, was slightly open, not wide, just enough to create a thin dark line where it should have been sealed shut, and my stomach dropped instantly. Because I knew I had locked it, I remembered turning the key, hearing the click, and seeing it closed before I walked away. And the realization hit all at once, sharp and undeniable. They had been down there, watching me go up, waiting for me to commit to being above them, and then they moved, not randomly, not in panic, but with timing, with purpose, and now they had been inside the one place in that building that was supposed to be secure. And my mind started racing through everything that meant, the monitors, the keys, the logs. Everything that gave me control over the building was in that booth, and now it wasn't just a place I used. It was a place they had entered, and I felt that shift again, deeper than before, because whatever distance had existed between me and them was gone now, completely gone, and I wasn't ahead of the situation anymore. I was reacting to it, and I moved quickly this time, not running, but faster than before, heading back toward the stairs. My flashlight bouncing slightly with each step, my focus locked on getting back down to the floor, because I needed to see what had changed, what they had touched, what they had taken, if anything, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I paused for just a fraction of a second listening again, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no movement, just that same heavy silence that had been there all night, and I started down, each step louder than I wanted it to be, each sound echoing through the space. in a way that made me feel exposed, and when I reached the bottom, I didn't go straight to the booth. I angled slightly to the side, approaching it from an angle where I could see inside before stepping directly in front of the door. And as I got closer, my chest tightened again, because the door wasn't just slightly open anymore. It was wide enough to see the glow of the monitors inside, and I slowed down, my flashlight lowering instinctively as I got within a few feet, and then I looked inside, and for a second, my brain didn't fully process what I was seeing because everything looked normal. The chair, the desk, the screens, nothing overturned, nothing obviously disturbed, and then I noticed the one thing that made everything stop. The camera feed on the main monitor wasn't showing the warehouse floor anymore. It was showing the inside of the mezzanine office I had just left, the exact room with the sleeping bag and the backpack, and the angle was perfect, positioned from the corner, looking directly at the doorway. Like someone had set it up specifically to watch anyone who entered, and I felt something drop in my chest, cold and final, because that wasn't just proof that they had been in the booth. It was proof that they had been watching me while I was up there, not from a distance, not from a hidden position, but directly, deliberately, through the system I thought I controlled, and in that moment, I understood something that made everything before it feel small. I hadn't been looking for them in the building. They had been watching me move through it the entire time. I don't remember deciding to leave, not in a clear, logical way. It wasn't a thought that formed and then turned into action. It was something more instinctive than that, like my body reached a point where it understood something my mind was still trying to process. And the moment I saw that camera feed my own system, turned around, pointed at the exact room I had just been standing in, I knew. There was nothing left in that building worth staying for. Not the job, not the explanation, not even the need to understand what was happening. Because whatever control I thought I had was gone, completely gone, and I stepped back from the booth slowly at first. My eyes still locked on that monitor, like it might change if I looked away, like whatever had set that up might be nearby. Watching my reaction, but nothing moved, nothing changed. Just that static image of the empty room upstairs, the sleeping bag, the backpack, the open doorway. Waiting. And that was the worst part, because it didn't feel like something that had already happened. It felt like something that was still happening. Like I was still inside it, still being observed. Still part of something I didn't understand. And that thought was enough to push me into motion. Real motion this time, not cautious, not controlled, just purposeful. I turned away from the booth and headed straight for the front exit. My pace faster now, my flashlight barely steady in my hand as I moved through the aisles, and I didn't care about the routine anymore. Didn't care about checking corners or scanning shadows, because the fear had changed again. It wasn't about what I might see anymore. It was about what I couldn't, and every step toward the door felt longer than it should have, like the space was stretching out in front of me. And I kept expecting to hear something behind me, footsteps, movement, anything that would confirm I wasn't alone in that moment. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the lights above. And when I finally reached the front entrance, I didn't slow down, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handle, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the cold night air. And the moment I was outside, it hit me all at once. The silence, the openness, the fact that there were no walls around me anymore, no shadows closing in from every direction, just the empty parking lot stretching out under dim lights, and I kept moving, not stopping, until I reached my car, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked it and got inside, locking the doors immediately behind me. And I sat there for a second, just breathing, trying to bring my thoughts back into something that made sense, something that felt grounded. But it was hard, because everything about that night had shifted the way I understood that place, and as I looked back toward the warehouse, I felt that same awareness settle in again, not inside the building this time, but attached to it, like whatever had been happening in there. Wasn't contained by the walls, and for a moment I considered just driving away, leaving without saying anything. But I didn't. I pulled out my phone and called 911. My voice steadier than I expected as I explained the situation, told them someone had been inside, that I had found evidence of them staying there, that they had accessed the security booth, and that I was outside waiting. And they told me to stay where I was, that units were on the way, and I did. I sat there in that car watching the building, watching every entrance, every side, waiting for any sign of movement, But nothing happened, no doors opened, no lights changed. Just the same still structure sitting in front of me like it always had, and after what felt like too long, the first patrol car pulled into the lot, then another, and I stepped out to meet them, walking them through everything as clearly as I could. From the door being unlatched, to the food, to the lights, to the mezzanine office, and they listened. Really listened, not dismissing it, the way my supervisor had. And they went inside, 2 of them at first, then more, sweeping the building section by section while I waited outside. And the time between them entering and coming back out felt longer than anything else that night because I didn't know what they would find. Didn't know if they would confirm everything or if they would come back and tell me it was nothing, that I had misread it. But when they finally came out, their expressions told me everything before they even spoke. They had found the room exactly as I described it. The sleeping bag, the backpack, the lantern, all of it still there, but there was no one inside, no sign of anyone leaving. No indication of where they had gone, just the space itself, like someone had stepped out of it moments before they arrived. And one of the officers asked me how long I had been working there, and when I told him, he nodded slightly, like he was putting something together in his head, and later, after everything was documented, after the reports were filed, after they told me I was free to go, one of them pulled me aside and said something that stayed with me longer than anything else that night. He said based on what they found, how the space was set up, the amount of supplies, the condition of everything, it didn't look like someone who had just recently started staying there. It looked like someone who had been there for a while, weeks at least, maybe longer. And I felt that same cold weight settle in again because I knew exactly how long I had been working there. 9 weeks. And I didn't go back after that, not for another shift, not even for my last paycheck. I sent a message to my supervisor and that was it. Because some things don't need closure, they don't need explanation, they just need distance. And even now, years later, it's not the dark that stays with me. It's not the building or the job or even the idea of someone hiding in a place they shouldn't be. It's the realization that I wasn't alone in that space from the beginning, that while I was learning the layout, getting comfortable, building a routine, someone else was already there, already watching, already understanding everything about me before I even realized they existed. And the worst part is, if I hadn't noticed those small things, the door, the food, the lights, I probably never would have known. At all, and that's what stays with you, not what you see, but what you almost didn't. Subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare,